This going here. All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nate. I am the Tuleyome Adventures and Engagement Director. It's a fancy title that means that I get to go out and hike in the mountains in the northern inner coast range, which is on the west side of the Sacramento Valley. Specifically, I do those hikes and trail building activities in the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument region. It's a wonderful place. If you haven't been out there before, you should come on a hike with me. And if you don't want to go on a hike with me, that's okay. You can go to Stebbins Cold Canyon, just outside of Winters, right by the dam at Lake Berryessa. And that is a wonderful place to go hiking and explore and see what the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument has to offer. And a lot of people like going there. One of those people that likes going there is our guest lecturer tonight. That's Robin Carlson. You can see her up there. Hello. Before I get to her, though, I just want to say that this is Tuleyome offers this lecture series, our Nature and You lecture series, once a month. It's the fourth Thursday evening of every month. We start in January tonight, and we go all the way through October. We leave November and December free because people tend to be busy those times. So the fourth Thursday of every month, look for us. We have lectures. We are still on Zoom, but we are hoping to go a hybrid version soon, some in person, but at the same time be held via Zoom. So check our website for more information and upcoming lectures there. So tuleyome.org, TULEYOME.org, and you can go to our events calendar there. So as I said, Robin likes to go hiking at Stebbins Cold Canyon Reserve, and she likes to draw pictures too. And so she is here to talk about this, the Cold Canyon Fire Journals, which is her book, her first book, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Correct.
Yes. So I'm going to turn it over to her with the last note from me that if you have questions for her, go ahead and hold on to them until the end of the presentation, or you can use the chat feature, and I will be monitoring that, and I can ask the questions at the end. So all the questions will be at the end. And Robin, I think I'm finally done with my announcements. Take it away.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be talking to all of you this evening. I'm going to start my presentation here. Let me just a second get this into the slide view. So before I start talking about this project in particular, I just want to do a little bit of background about how I came to do this. So my background is in originally in evolutionary biology, because I have always been motivated more than anything else by understanding the process of change, essentially in life in this world. And so I started out thinking about change on a much broader time frame. So thinking about evolutionary change, why do plants and animals look the way that they do now? How did that happen over time? What were the specific interactions between all of these different animals and plants and their environment that meant that they changed and became the way that they are now? I went from that to looking at change on a considerably shorter time scale. I worked for a long time in stream habitat restoration projects to benefit salmon and steelhead in California. So looking at the processes needed to help streams and riparian areas return to a healthier environment to support both the salmon and steelhead and all of the other species that live there as well. And so that was still done in a much more project and data and other kinds of reporting ways of communicating. But I've also, at the same time on the side, been extremely interested in using visual forms of communication. I have always sketched in the field, sketched the world around me, and have used that as a critical way of understanding just my life and the world my entire life. And what I really wanted to do was to be able to continue to look at environmental change, but to be able to then communicate that with other people, you know, in a really visual way, because I think that that is an extremely powerful way of helping to communicate scientific topics and other, you know, other important information about the natural world. And so I started transitioning in my career to becoming, you know, to actually spending my working time doing natural science illustration. And this is an example of a poster that I did not too long ago for Caltrans, illustrating healthy stream habitat and some of the species that rely on it. And what I try to do in all of my artwork is to keep a really holistic view at all times of whatever the particular species or concepts are that I'm illustrating, how do they fit into the rest of the world around them? And what are all of those different interactions, or at least a glimpse into those interactions that make up an ecosystem? So another example for Caltrans, illustrating some endangered species that might be encountered on road construction projects and what to do with them. Again, showing the species in their habitat, showing what that might mean then when there's, you know, big work projects being done in and around that habitat. And then looking at, for example, this is an interpretive sign that I did down in San Luis Obispo County for the Land Conservancy of San Luis Obispo County, illustrating a sequence of habitats going from beach up to oak woodland and all of the species that live there. So in addition to doing these, you know, very detailed and much more finished illustrations where I'm spending a whole lot of time at my desk trying to make things accurate and, you know, rendered more carefully, I have used field sketching my whole life as a way to understand what I'm looking at, what's around me, and how everything fits together. And I've been extremely interested in how to use that as a communication tool with other people, because I think that there's an emotional connection that you get with artwork that's done in the field, in the moment, actually looking at the things that you're trying to draw and communicate, that you really don't get any other way, that you don't get with this kind of more finished illustration. And so I had been looking around for a project that would allow me to follow environmental change in a particular location over time, because again, it's this aspect of time and how things are changing over time and how we experience that and how that compares to other places that I think is so critical for us to know what's going on in the world and to know what our place in it is and to know how everything fits together. And so I was looking for a specific project to do this with and to use field sketching as a primary communication tool. And so there was one more example of illustration work. This is actually at Cold Canyon, a interpretive sign showing some of the species that are impacted at the different times of year for a seasonal stream like Cold Creek is there, species that are utilizing that flowing water and species that utilize the dry creek bed in the summers. So in 2015, the rag fire burned. It burned through the entire area of Stebbins Cold Canyon Reserve and surrounding area as well. And I sort of, you know, first the fire happened and I heard it had burned Cold Canyon, and I, you know, had this immediate reaction of, oh my goodness, you know, this is terrible. That's a beautiful place. It's a place I love to go hike. How sad that it burned. And that was, you know, that was my reaction at first. And then fairly quickly, it started to dawn on me, well, this is going to be a place that's going to be experiencing really rapid change, really easily observable rapid change after the fire. And it's a place that's open to the public. And moreover, it's a place where there is a lot of active scientific research going on as well. So it's this great intersection of a place that's really loved by people that live around it. So it's well known. It's a great place to use as a way to understand and explain fire ecology. It's a place where there are probably scientists who I could ask questions about what was going on and, learn more through their research. and it's close to where I live, so it is extremely convenient. So it started to dawn on me that here was potentially a fantastic opportunity. So I suspect that many, if not everyone on this call, knows where Cold Canyon is, but I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page. This is my standard location map, just showing that Stebbins Cold Canyon is the southernmost part of the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument. So it's part of a very important set of protected areas. So I went just a little over a month after the fire had happened. It took me a little while to realize the opportunity that this presented. I went up. The area was closed to the public because there are a number of hazards in an area that has just burned, and there was a lot of trail rebuilding work that needed to happen. So I came up and I looked in from the highway, respecting the closure, just to get an idea of what it looked like and to start thinking about what I might do there as a project. And so this was the very first drawing that I did there. And then not that long after that, I went on a guided hike offered by the natural reserves to, take a short hike into the canyon and have the then director of the reserve, Jeffrey Clary, tell us about what had happened in the fire, what that meant potentially for the habitats there, how the natural reserve system was planning on, responding and managing the area after the fire. And was sort of the final piece in this being such a perfect place to study fire ecology from a sort of a lay person's documenting point of view, because they were going to do trail work and make it safe for the public to hike there, but there wasn't going to be any other kind of intervention into any of the ecological processes that were going to have to happen after fire. There wasn't going to be any replanting or anything like that that would alter the sort of the natural response of those habitats to fire. Of course, there being pretty heavy public use of the area, it's important to remember that does, of course, have an impact on how the habitats are going to respond. But there wasn't going to be any, active restoration activity there, which was also great from my perspective. So these are just a couple of the pictures I took on that first visit on the guided hike, just sort of giving an idea of what it looked like right after that first 2015 fire, and as a sort of a reminder to myself of my original feelings when I started this project, which was still very much, oh, this is so sad. It was so pretty there, and now it's burned. And of course I know that habitats regrow after fire, but really it's a tragedy now that has to be recovered from. And so that was absolutely the way that I approached the project from the beginning. Is I'm going to watch the recovery, the regrowth, the rebirth of this, this beautiful canyon. So from that first visit, I did a few initial sketches, and I want to talk just a little bit more about why I wanted to do this project as a sketching and nature journaling and visual project. Sketching is a fantastic way to make sure that I slow down when I'm out anywhere. It doesn't have to be a natural environment, but for this example, when I'm on a hike, so in some natural area, to really slow down and think about my surroundings and move more slowly, and just because I'm stopping and taking the time to draw and to make the observations I need to make in order to figure out how to get the scene that I'm looking at onto the page, I'm noticing so much more of what's going on around me than if I was just happily hiking down the trail. Noticing things, but not stopping and sort of waiting for other things to become apparent as I'm moving more slowly and looking. So these are some sketches of what the creek bed looked like on that first visit. So it was still, full of the sediment that had washed down the hillsides because there had been rain. This was in December, and there had been rain since the fire, which had washed a lot of that loosened soil down
Oh, did we lose Robin or did we lose me? Oh, there we go. Robin, are you back? Oh, but you're muted. I get to use my mug. You're on mute.
Okay.
All right, there we go. You're
I'm
back.
unmuted.
All
How
right,
long
back
was
at.
I gone?
Let's see. You were still on that why you were sketching.
Oh, okay.
The
So I
benefits
wasn't
of
gone for
slowing
long.
down and being out in nature. Yeah.
Okay, great. Good. That was not for very long. Fantastic. Let me get back to the slideshow and make it large. So yeah, so going into the project, what I decided was that I would try to visit Cold Canyon once a month at least, so that I was there regularly enough that I would get a fairly good sense of what plants were appearing when and blooming when, and a lot of that seasonal cycle, but a realistic time frame to that I would actually be able to keep doing it consistently. And that I would, go each time with a sketchbook and, my drawing tools with me, and would essentially just keep all of my senses open to whatever jumped out at me, because I was not going with any specific questions about fire ecology in mind at all. It was very much a, what does this entire process look like? What sort of big picture things can I see happening, and then what tiny details also can I see and can I follow along with? And so this was very intentionally a way to make sure that I was consistently there through each season, and just regularly through the years. So this is just an example. This is actually even more than I usually take out in the field with me. I'm either hiking with just a sketchbook and a pen, or with either one or the other of these two ways of adding color too. So either with a really limited set of watercolors, or just a few colored pencils to do some really simple color notes along the way. But while I think it's really important to be stopping and drawing, I also don't want to be slowed down by thinking about lots of different art supplies and getting too picky, too fussy about making perfect drawings and getting lost in the art supplies. So at the same time as I was making all of these visits, because I went into this not having any in-depth knowledge about fire ecology at all, just having a basic sense of some of the different ways that habitats respond, but nothing specific. I was doing a lot of research at the same time, to get a general picture of fire ecology, and then more specifically what fire cycles look like in the habitats that are at Cold Canyon. And so this is just an example of a really rough map that I made myself for reference as I was getting more familiar, in a more specific way than I ever had been before, having hiked in Cold Canyon a lot, but not ever having tried to focus in any great detail to what exactly grows there and where it grows within the canyon. So this was a way of just understanding the basic details about what the habitats are there, and where those habitats are, and how they alternate with each other, and what I'm encountering where when I'm hiking there. So the next sort of set of things that I want to walk through in this presentation is just a few of the different stories that I discovered through the course of this project, because the thing that I had a sense of before I started the project, having done lots of observational drawing in the past, but that was sort of proven to me in a more complete way than I had ever imagined, was once you start looking really carefully at the world around you, and especially at a single place over and over again over time, it's just really amazing how many different stories and narratives and different pieces of the picture just sort of reveal themselves to you as you're doing this. The benefits of this close and careful observation in a way that isn't, I mean, that is still sort of open to seeing everything around me at one time. So I'm not just there to answer a specific research question. So I'm not completely focused in on a single thing. I'm, letting things appear to me as I'm looking around. But it is still really, close, repeated observation. And so that was eventually what led to writing the book was, having uncovered all of these stories, had them come to me. Essentially, that's what it felt like, experiencing it this way. And so I want to go through and share a few of those. Probably one of the first ones, and definitely one of the most dramatic ones, is something that I think we're all familiar with living in California. When an area burns, plants return really quickly. So knowing that is one thing. Experiencing it in some ways is another. Just how quickly new green growth appears at the bases of shrubs. And it's, it certainly came as a surprise to me. It shouldn't have, but it came as a surprise to me thinking, well, the fire was in the summer, and even before there's been any rain, there's all this green growth, and that doesn't seem, it didn't, at least to me, seem completely intuitive. But of course, that's one of the most important things to understand in coming to realize that fire is not the tragedy that I went into this thinking, is realizing that there's so much that's still alive, even in an area that right after the fire looks like everything was killed. So, there's all these charred, lit tangle of limbs of shrubs above ground, and it looks like the plant is dead, and the plant is very much not dead. The plant is perfectly fine underground. All of the most important parts of the plant are completely alive and have all of the nutrients and moisture that they need to get going again right away. And so it's this dramatic immediate growth, even in a really dry time of year, in a dry climate. And so getting to experience that over and over again with a bunch of different species of the chaparral shrubs that live in Cold Canyon. So with chamise in that first picture that I just showed, with coyote brush, with redbud too, Yerba Santa, and this is a different case, but also immediately starts growing right after fire from its rhizomes. Looking at bay laurel, I was blown away early on by the sort of amazing illustration of all of the active buds waiting to start growing again from the root base of the burned laurel tree. And it was this amazing set of sprouts coming out of it in these glowing chartreuse and red colors, almost this sort of flame-like exuberance growing out of the root. So that was really probably the first thing that made me really start to rethink the idea that a burned landscape is a tragic landscape that has to have a rebirth, realizing that there are plenty of things that don't need a rebirth because they're still growing just fine. This is part of their life cycle that they evolved with, that chaparral habitats burn periodically, and that this is an important part of even keeping those chaparral shrubs healthy. They're not, it isn't a tragedy for them in any way that they've burned. It is a good thing, and they aren't being reborn because they never died. And so that was a really important shift. One thing I also want to mention at this point is a little more context about the timing of the fire, starting to talk about how chaparral has evolved with fire. So the rag fire in 2015 was just almost 30 years after the after the last time that Cold Canyon had burned. And so that is still on the short end, but almost into what is, at least right now, considered a healthy fire interval in chaparral habitats. So in one of the major habitats at Cold Canyon. Generally, they like more of a 60 to 100-year interval between fires, but 30 years still gives most of the things that live there time to grow and set seeds and be ready to grow again after another fire. So what I was observing in these years after the rag fire was chaparral regrowing in the way that it has evolved to regrow. So then, of course, the next thing that jumps out is all of the wildflowers that grow in abundance after fire, because the fire has removed a lot of the canopy, a lot of the leaf cover that creates enough shade that in a mature chaparral ecosystem, there aren't as many wildflowers growing because they just don't have as much opportunity to reach light and other resources that they need. And so here is another set of organisms that don't find fire to be a tragedy at all. And in fact, this is the best time for them to grow in this habitat. So enjoying things like large-leaved houndstongue and some lupin and some golden fairy lantern, a lot of these early flowers that come back after fire. And then a fantastic example that's not a fantastic picture, but it's a fantastic example of what an opportunity it is for some wildflowers after fire. On the right-hand side of this picture is whispering bells, which is something that only grows in Cold Canyon after fire, for the few years after a fire. So whispering bells had not been seen in Cold Canyon in between the two fires. So for approximately 30 years, there hadn't been whispering bells growing in Cold Canyon. So it was super exciting in the spring after the rag fire to see it growing there again. Its seeds had been waiting underground for the nitrogen cue from the wildfire smoke to start germination again, because they are truly waiting for the opportunities of light and space and water that fire opens up for them. And so they grew for a few years after the rag fire and then disappeared again until the next fire. And we will get to that in a little bit. And then, of course, it's hard to miss things like, the wonderful carpets of poppies that are enjoying space and light and resources. And so these are just a few sketchbook pages from really early on after the fire, when I was, just sort of bowled over by all of the different flowers and trying to draw them and make note of them and identify them, because this was also a really great way for me to learn all of the species of Cold Canyon in much greater detail and much more completely than I had before. And then also to sort of follow the story as it continues from the wildflowers that are seizing on this opportunity to grow in this environment after the fire, to all of the insects then that are also, making great use of all of the resources, making use of the flowers that have come, also potentially making use of light and space. And then even, one more, with insects in it and, enjoying flowers and other resources like that. And, getting to follow specific stories of watching first pipevine swallowtail caterpillars on California pipevine, which, grew back right away after the fire. And there were large numbers of, this is actually a drawing from more recently, but right after the fire in 2016 too, there were, on my visits in April, there were large numbers of caterpillars, and then later lots of butterflies in the canyon. And they are certainly there, anytime, not just after fires. But again, the pipevine was clearly enjoying the light and the space after the fire. And then something else that some of the stories definitely did not become apparent all at once. There were all sorts of wonderful things to learn in 2016, right after the fire. But then continuing this project over the years, and then also continuing to learn about fire in other contexts as well, helped flesh out the story and make it even more complete. As I learned about some of the other details of insects that not only like a recently burned habitat, but the insects that are drawn to a still burning habitat. So insects that come as the fire is still burning, because what that tells them is that there are trees and shrubs in distress that will be either dead or considerably weakened, making them wonderful places for the insects to lay their eggs and for their larvae to then eat the wood without encountering a lot of the natural defenses that a healthy tree or a shrub would be able to mount. And so this particular example is of horntail wasps, which I learned about in the Klamath as I was participating in a controlled burning event to learn more about what happens when fire is actually occurring. But I'm bringing it up now because this is an important connection then. We sort of from flowers to insects, and also from trees and shrubs to insects, and then to birds, for example, though certainly also anything else that eats insects like lizards and snakes, etc. Also find this recently burned landscape a marvelous opportunity because of the insects that have come to the landscape. Now there's, that's all that much more food for a whole bunch of different birds. It's also important nesting cavities for woodpeckers, because the dead trees are also wonderful places for them to excavate for nests. But lots of other birds enjoy sometimes the open spaces for foraging, and they certainly enjoy the new seeds that are, have become available because of the plants that are enjoying this environment. Also the insects, like I mentioned before. So one of the other things was again paying specific attention to the seasonal stream, because that adds another layer of interest to not only looking at fire recovery over the years, but what that means for the stream itself, and also, in the summer being able to look really carefully at what plants are still even growing, making use of the creek bed that looks dry at the surface but is still quite wet underground, and is a really important research in the middle of a hot, dry summer for a lot of plants and a lot of insects as well. So one of the other stories that I followed was to look at the trees, the species of trees that grow in Cold Canyon. So there's a lot of chaparral. There's also a lot of oak woodland, and there are two main tree oak species that grow there: interior live oak and blue oak. And I tried, it's really easy, I find, on hikes to focus in on the tiny details as I'm walking down the tree, but I also tried to, step back and take a look at more landscape views and what the landscape looked like. And one of the things that struck me a lot over the years after the fire was these, how starkly it showed where trees grew on the hillsides, because there would still be these, these swaths of essentially tree skeletons that were these sort of hazy purple rivers of ghost trees that were a sort of a fascinating entrance into asking more specific questions about what was going on with the trees, and learning about some of the different patterns of the ways that oaks regrow, that blue oaks tend to, if they haven't been burned too severely, tend to resprout leaves in their crowns, and the interior live oaks tend to sprout from their bases, which was interesting. And so continuing to look at tree resprouting, and then also there are gray pines that grow at Cold Canyon, and I was very interested to follow them after the fire, and had thought for quite a while that it looked like quite a few of them probably had survived because for years after the fire, they persisted in having green needles in their canopies, at least in some places, like you can see in these sketches. But after, it was probably about 4 years after the fire, in talking to scientists, I learned that even though pines may look like they're still doing okay after a fire, a lot of times, gray pines specifically, are just taking a really long time to die, even though they've actually been killed by the fire. That gray pines are not adapted to survive fire very well. The way that they live in habitats that burn is that the fire generally kills them, and they're not in that habitat as much for a while, and then they just recolonize from outside the habitat because they're very good at moving into chaparral and oak woodland areas in a sort of a scattered way. But it was another interesting shift in perspective to realize that there can be years when it looks like the tree is alive, and it is, but it's just very slowly dying, and it's sort of already determined that it is eventually going to die. And so that helped me shift my thinking to longer time frames, and understanding that you really can't survey and decide exactly what impact the fire has had on the habitat right away, or even for years after the fire. One other thing that I found out several years after the fire, when hiking with a woman who worked for the BLM, and she was telling me about things that she could see still in the patterns at Cold Canyon, these interesting patterns of the way the trees look after the fire. And so it's a phenomenon called foliage freeze. And so when there are hot winds blowing during a fire, often that will, now the tree or the shrub is not necessarily killed, but these branches are dead at this point, and they get frozen into sort of the last shape they held in. So you can see the directions of the wind from the patterns that these that their branches make. And so there's this interesting, sort of long-lasting record on the landscape of what the fire did while it was there, which was completely fascinating to learn about. So, and just quickly, again, continuing the tree theme, I also got completely caught up in the details of all sorts of different galls that live, especially on the oaks. This is on valley oaks just outside of Cold Canyon, but the blue oaks in Cold Canyon have a great diversity of galls on them too. And that was exciting to explore as well as part of the larger story of trees in the canyon. A story that definitely did not come from my own visits, but came from my research, at my sort of scientific paper research at home. I happened upon this amazing note in a herpetology journal from a scientist who was the reserve manager at Hastings Natural Reserve and was conducting a controlled burn 20 years or so ago. And had happened to been, he was sort of at the front of this. It was a very low intensity calm fire moving slowly up a hillside, and he was observing and happened to see two California newts in the unburned area of the hillside, both walk intentionally into the flame front. And as they walked into the flames, they foamed up, as if they'd been sprayed with fire retardant, and foamed up, kept walking, walked through the flames. Again, this was, it was a narrow band of flames, walked through them into the burned area on the other side, looked completely unharmed. The scientist picked one up, brushed off the foam. It was sort of dry and it just brushed right off. And he said he could tell the newt was completely fine. He'd handled tons of newts, and it was readily apparent it was fine. He set it back down and they went on their way. And so this was, all of the things that I was observing myself led to questions and discoveries that hint at some amazing things that we certainly have no idea about in the way that other species experience fire and have adapted to live with fire. And also don't see fire as, an enormous tragedy, at least not all the time. Obviously, that adaptation of the newts is only going to work through a certain limited amount of flames, but just hints at all of the adaptations we may have absolutely no idea about, because it's so hard to be there observing in the midst of wildfire. And so one last example of a story, and again, it's just to reiterate how important it is to be in a place repeatedly, paying close attention, and building up the experiences of learning about that place, and having your eyes open for particular things. So I had heard that when the Tuleyome berries were ripe, at a particular time each year, flocks of robins would descend on the canyon and, in the course of a few days, just eat, huge numbers of Tuleyome berries and then move on. And I'd heard about it. And it happened that I was hiking in the canyon and walked into a clump of Tuleyomes and startled out a whole bunch of robins and thought, oh, this is great. I'm here for this. And it turned out that the rest of that hike, I kept following them and startling them out of bushes of Tuleyome. And that entire hike turned into, just because I'd happened to notice and had been paying attention to something that someone had told me, turned into this story about robins. I found robin droppings along the trail, since that's often what I'm trying to pay attention to get an idea of what species are around me that I'm not going to see directly. I saw a place where there was a big pile of feathers that I think were robin feathers, where maybe one had been caught. Or attempted to be caught. And then at the end, as I was heading back, finished with my hike, I happened to look down the hill off to the side of the trail, and I saw a dead robin lying there. I couldn't see any evidence of what had killed it, but it very much made that hike seem like an entire arc through robin's life cycle of all of this joyous feeding and then death at the end. And so again, it's been amazing how many stories just sort of jump out once I've been in, coming to this place and asking these questions and paying attention all of this time. So then what turned out to be sort of an interesting final visit to this first chapter of visiting Cold Canyon after the Rag Fire, what turned out to be my last visit before the canyon burned again, was a visit in March, where I thought, oh, won't it be great? I'm going to actually visually document all the places that I stop to draw flowers on this hike, mostly flowers. There's probably a few other things on there, so that I have this, this sort of geographic visual of my trip that time. And so that was a lot of fun. I drew a lot of flowers and caterpillars and other things. And then COVID happened and the reserve was closed for a while. And then, well, actually the lead in is that since the 2015 fire, I had been watching as the area around Cold Canyon every summer, somewhere very nearby, burned. And so, documenting some of those other fires over time, I was figuring that it was probably not going to be that long before Cold Canyon burned again. With drought and other impacts of climate change, it looked like it was probably not going to be 30 years before the next fire there. And of course, in 2020, all of the lightning complex fires happened, and the fire in Cold Canyon merged with the larger LNU lightning complex. And so that really sort of put an end to the first phase of my project, and sort of started an entirely new phase to what I was investigating at Cold Canyon. And so, having learned everything I had up to that point, in 2020, I very much believed that wildfire is not a horrible tragedy that the entire ecosystem needs to be reborn from. But it was really interesting to watch my own reaction in 2020, because my own reaction was still very much. Oh dear. Oh dear, this does feel like a tragedy again because, here are all these very, very specific plants, for example, a lot of shrubs that I've been following, as they regrew after the 2015 fire. And my first thought still was, but now they're gone. There's these friends that I have been visiting and they're gone. And I had to very consciously think, well, of course they're not gone. I've already learned that they're not gone. It's just the above ground portion that's gone. But it was a really, really excellent um, um, way for me to understand truly how deeply ingrained our our modern reaction to fire is. It's, even if you know all of these things, it's very hard still not to have this visceral reaction that fire destroys, and fire destroys, almost everything in the places that it burns. So I went back to the canyon and started visiting again. And with all of this new information, one, the new perspectives on what fire means, and then also having learned a lot about just the ways that fire burns, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. But having been learning from the BLM handbook about investigating fire and all of the signs that you can read on the land about how the fire burns and what that means. What that meant was, in this second chapter of Following Cold Canyon After Fire, I was coming back with a lot more specific questions and a lot more, things that I really wanted to see if I could read in the landscape when I was there. And I also was able to start visiting sooner. Both times I got permission through the reserves to be there with a research permit while it was closed. And so this time I was there considerably sooner after the fire. And so I was able to walk in a more recently burned landscape than I had before, which was great too. So this definitely became a chance to see what I could see about which direction the fire had been moving in certain places, and look for things like rock spalling, where the flakes of rock break off, looking at, all of the different patterns that I could see right away. The amazing imprints of trees that fell while they were still burning and then left traces down the hillside of pretty much the outline of the tree in white ash, where they had completely, burned up and finished burning after they'd fallen. So that was then also so because it had only been 5 years since the previous fire, since the rag fire, this also became an entry into understanding the bigger picture of what's happening in California and the West, and really in the rest of the world too, as fire regimes have been changing due to climate change. So what happens when ecosystems burn more frequently than what they have evolved to handle? What happens when the conditions are such, because of drought, that when they burn much more uniformly or over a larger area? And what that means for Cold Canyon specifically, and what that means more generally for habitats in the West. And that this became a way to start exploring some of those questions. And one of the ways that I did that was by talking to scientists who are addressing these questions. And one of the groups of scientists that I got to go out with were some lichen biologists, looking at what happens after fire and how lichens return. And I got to follow them around at Quail Ridge Reserve, which hasn't burned as many times in the last 100 years as Cold Canyon, and so was a really interesting laboratory after the LNU fires when it did burn, for setting up. They set up some experiments to understand how lichens come back, what are the things that limit the ways that they come back, and what that means when there's smaller and smaller intervals between fires. And so one of the things that I learned about that is there are some lichens that take quite a long time to return, and that even the 30-year interval between fires at Cold Canyon mean that there were some very slow returning lichens that probably hadn't made it back then. And there are many more lichens that wouldn't have made it back after a 5-year interval. And so that's just one tiny piece of that. Other things that I've learned is after this 5-year interval, there are shrubs that don't return after fire by resprouting from their burls, from their roots. They have to grow back from seeds, and 5 years isn't long enough for them to grow back from seeds. And so people are seeing fewer of those seeding shrubs at Cold Canyon now. And also plants that grow from bulbs, like soap plant, have a harder time coming back after a short period. And so that really was an entry into this really big story about what's happening as climate change alters how fires burn. But what that also led to was me understanding even more that not only has fire always been an important part of these ecosystems, but that fire is part of the answer to as much as possible keeping ecosystems healthy in the future too, even with climate change and all of these sort of accelerating fire cycles. Fire itself is still really important because it helps in many ways maintain the resilience of the ecosystems, often because because even when, and it's something that I saw in the 2020 fire, again, even when it's been a short interval, from personal experience, it's not like the fire wiped out the entire canyon that time either. So fire moves very differently through different parts of the habitat, and because of those because of that sort of diverse mosaic pattern of burning, that helps preserve little pockets of species here and species there, and helps maintain this sort of diverse interchange between habitats that helps that area still be more resilient in the future. Eventually, as fires burn, more homogeneously, that stops being able to, being able to help the health of everything. But what we have learned, one of the other things that I learned in talking to other scientists, is that areas that are allowed to burn still through lightning strikes and other natural causes of fire, Yosemite has been this amazing case study where they have been since the 70s following fairly enlightened fire management practices of letting wildfires that aren't threatening human habitation, letting those burn and conducting controlled burns. And so some of the large fires like the Rim Fire, and even some more recent ones that have burned Yosemite and the areas just outside of Yosemite, you can see this enormous difference that inside Yosemite, where there have been fires over time, fire has not been completely excluded from those areas. These larger wildfires burned completely differently. They burned in a much more heterogeneous manner, and some areas got burned severely, some areas got burned much less severely, and all of those different types of burning are really important as long as they are in this more fine-grained mosaic just outside the park, where there's in private land management where fire has been excluded. Then these large wildfires burned, much greater areas all the same way, leaving much less ability to be resilient and recover. And so the final thing that I want to touch on briefly as I wrap this up is a local example of a place that I've been able to observe fire directly, as sort of going back to the beginning of the story of all of this, seeing what fire looks like and what it looks like as it's happening, and what that is like for the plants and animals at the time. So the Cache Creek Conservancy has a tending and gathering garden that is run by Native American leadership and has been, for the past few years, has been conducting controlled burns there as part of the overall management of the garden. I've been able to attend a few now, cultural and controlled burns there. And so these are just a few pictures from the first one that I attended. And so this was this great opportunity to be, be really close to fire as it was happening, to really understand what the plants were that were being burned, and to be able to, very specifically understand what was happening to them. Being able to watch things like the way that cattails burn, and being able to then examine right afterwards, what the patterns left behind on them were by the fire. And also being able to see things like these are patches of deer grass that are still burning. At the end of the burn, one of the firefighters there noticed some movement at the bottom of one of those burned deer grass clumps, reached in and pulled out this perfectly happy, unharmed juvenile alligator lizard that had just been hanging out at the very bottom of the clump, where there was still plenty of moisture, so it was cool enough that it was fine, even as the top of the clump was burning. And so was just this another great, a way to actually personally observe some of the ways that, even while fire is happening, it's not a monolithic destructive force, and there are plenty of ways for many species to be right there with the fire, unconcerned, unharmed, just going about their daily life. And then it's also been an opportunity to return after the burns and see some of the immediate impacts of, in some cases, wildflowers that had not been growing there before the fire, because the fire cued it. Some plants that there'd been seeds obviously waiting in the soil returned, like this gumweed, like some narrowleaf milkweed that hadn't been growing there before the fire, but was obviously just waiting for its opportunity. Then to look at some of the grasses that whose health is maintained by the periodic burning, and also to understand some of the cultural uses of some of these plants that require fire. Understanding how burning regularly helps Thule not get completely full of thatch at its base, which helps it remain a really important nesting resource for tricolored blackbirds. And even looking at things like some of the fungi that come immediately after fire, because they find some great resources in the burned wood. And then I'm just gonna stop on this slide at the end. These are just some of the chapter headings from my book that I'm ending on them just sort of as a summary of all of the different stories that I have been able to explore, that have come from truly paying attention and just visiting over and over and over again one place and watching it as it changes. And while the focus of this has all been fire, and I've learned so much about fire, what I think is the most important about it is all of these things that I've learned, and all of these new ways of thinking about ecological cycles definitely don't have to just apply to fire. This is, there's all these amazing things that can be learned by paying attention to one place as it changes, and just being open to all of the things happening around you, and what that means in terms of bigger stories. So I am ready for questions.
All right, great. Thank you, Robin. Before we get into questions that anybody has, can you tell us where we can purchase your book, how we can get that?
Yeah, so I believe there are, for people who are in Davis, I believe there are still copies at the Avid Reader. Otherwise, it is published by Heyday Books, and so you can buy it on their website, and then of course you can buy it at any other online book retailer that you might like to use.
Fantastic. Thank you. I am the host, so I get to ask the first question. Do you have or what was your favorite place to visit in Stebbins before the Rag Fire? And then where was your favorite place to visit in between the fires? And where is it after the LNU fire?
Well, that's a really good question. Um, well,
Or
so
you could just give us a couple places,
I
favorite
can,
places to visit.
yeah, I mean, it's going to be more, a slightly more practical answer. For a lot of my first visits, I didn't make it that far into the canyon because I was stopping and drawing and paying attention to all the little details along the way. So, but especially between 2015 and 2020, the majority of my visits truly were really the hike along the creek in the bottom of the canyon back to the homestead, and that was it. And I would use up all the time that I had to be out, because I stopped to draw too many times and didn't get much further. I did the loop hike up over the ridge and down through the canyon sometimes, but I definitely have to say just down by the creek was my favorite place to be because because that was where I spent the most time. I have, and again, it's less sort of specific circumstances of the fires. It's more just the evolution of the project. I've spent more time going up the ridge and going around since the 2020 fire, but it's not necessarily because of any specific thing that I'm looking for, just that my perspective has opened up some and I'm not getting quite so stuck in the same place because I have to see exactly what's changed in those places each time. But that's an awesome question.
Great. So somebody sent a message asking if you studied art at all.
So no, this is really all a lifetime of drawing in the field, of doing observational sketching. I did a little bit of art in high school. I mean, in actual art classes and summer programs in high school, but I have not done any official art training since then.
And then do you do like the finished drawing at home? Like you take a field sketch and then you do your finish up at home?
Yeah, so these, I didn't say it specifically, but these chapter heading things from the book were entirely to tie the book together and are completely illustrations done at home. Um, I'm going to go back just to the regular Cold Canyon ones. The sketchbooks that form the majority, sketchbook drawings that form the majority of what's in my book, are a mixture. So some of them I did the entire sketch in the field, drew it with line work and added color all in the field. Some of them I did the ink drawing in the field, and then added color at home. And then some of them were completely based on photographs that I took while I was there and then drew at home because even, even with all that stopping and getting lost in the sketching while I was there, that still never left me enough time to draw everything I wanted to. So I took photographs, both of the things that I drew so that I could come back and check details later in case I had questions, and then photographs of all the things that I didn't have time to draw and wanted to draw later. So these are all absolutely a mix of all three ways of working.
And I see a small hand lens down there. Do you use that hand lens when you're drawing as well?
So yeah, I almost exclusively just for lichens. So I use it for drawing in the field, and then I also use it to take pictures through with my iPhone for drawing later too.
All right. And then how many copies of the book are printed? This person has it and loves it, but just wondering how many were printed. And then how did you go about getting grants and getting Heyday to pay attention to it?
So yeah, so the print run, I believe, was 4,000 books. I can't swear to that, but it's something like that. Yeah, so Heyday is a small nonprofit publisher that focuses on California history and lots of natural history and some art usually related to natural history. And They were definitely my dream publisher long before I was truly turning this into a book. But the way that I actually got to work with them was through a wonderful introduction. I'm sure some of you on the call are familiar with John Muir Laws, who is an amazing natural history illustrator and also nature journaling educator in the Bay Area. And I met him on the controlled burn in the Klamath that I didn't talk about a lot in this presentation, but a bunch of nature journalers went and observed some controlled burns in the Klamath, and I met him there and showed him my sketchbooks from Cold Canyon, and talked to the group about what I had been doing. And he said, would you be interested in me introducing you to my publisher? And so it was thanks to a extremely generous introduction to Heyday by John Muir Laws that I got to work with them. And it was also, I just sort of want to highlight what a wonderful process it was working with Heyday, because there was definitely some back and forth in proposing the book and deciding what final form it should take, because I have been primarily a visual artist and have not been a writer, especially in a sort of literary way. And they thought that this really should have a lot of narrative to it, and sort of gave me the confidence to attempt to that. And I'm really glad I did, because I enjoyed that writing. And I think that I'm really pleased to have a book that has all of these field sketches alongside literary writing as well, and sort of lets the two tell the story hand in hand, but also somewhat independently. And so that's what I'm most proud of about the book.
Great. What was the most surprising thing that you learned throughout this whole process in your study, whether it's about lichen or the fire freezing of the branches? What was it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a really good question, because there's so many good candidates. I think the most surprising one is the foaming newts. I think that I learned so many surprising things and so many just deeply satisfying things in being able to follow all of these stories. But that one, this adaptation that, I mean, it's this tiny footnote in a herpetology journal, and I haven't seen anyone talking about it anywhere else. I tracked down and called up the scientist to talk to him about it, because I haven't seen anyone doing any other research on this. But just the entire world of adaptations to fire that seems like it opens up is so vast. And also just, I mean, the newts are walking around with essentially fire extinguishers. And it's probably the poison secretions that are doing this, that are serving this dual duty of making them toxic and unpalatable to predators, and also protecting them from fire. Is just amazing. And the way then that it allows the newts to just carry on with their business and walk right through the flames is just astounding. So that's an awesome question. And I think that has to be my top one.
Yeah, that's amazing. I don't know. I don't remember necessarily reading that in the book, but that is amazing that they do that. So thanks for pointing that out today. Let's see. If anybody else has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself, hop in. Otherwise, I have a couple other questions. You can also just put in the chat if you want. All right, I'll ask another question. Hiking out at Stebbins and pretty much anywhere, you get a bunch of different things all over the place. How much do you draw in one scene? Or do you have sometimes draw everything, or sometimes just focused on individual things?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I try to do as many different things as I can over time. I mean, like I mentioned at some point, I try to be really conscious about not just drawing the thing that I'm focusing on. So a butterfly catches my eye. I mean, you can see on this sketchbook page right here, there's a butterfly just sitting there. So obviously I do that too, but I try to, at least some of the time, make sure that I'm making a note in the drawing of what the butterfly is on, what's around it, always trying to put some context in, at least, of what the interactions are that I'm in the midst of. But it absolutely you can totally get lost if you try to record everything you see around you in one place, and then you don't get any further down the trail. And so it's definitely a balancing act between picking out the few things that seem to encapsulate, what that particular environment in front of you is, and not also have the chance to go observe a whole bunch of different parts too. So yeah, I mean, I definitely try to make it a range.
Great. All right. I've run out of my questions. So if anybody else has anything. Oh, I can't see the chat. No, Kevin K, I cannot see the chat. I don't know what's going on. I have it called up. So if you, I guess I'm not seeing it. Maybe if you send me a direct message, or you can send Robin a message, or you can just unmute yourself if you feel like chatting with us. Oh, here we go. All right. Okay, Kevin is asking, could it be said that a good burn maintains or increases biodiversity?
So yes, it's an excellent question. Yes, so fire absolutely has been, I mean, there's just never enough time to talk about all of the wonderful and important things that I've learned. So fire, all of the ecosystems in California evolved with fire to one degree or another. And so absolutely, fire has been a driving force in what these ecosystems look like, and absolutely in the incredible biodiversity that we have in California. And it's because of the things that the fire itself does in helping plants regenerate, and helping soil regenerate, just changing sort of the overall health of everything. And then also because of the way that fire interacts with these habitats. It's something I talk about in some detail in the book. One example is the different kinds of chaparral shrubs. Some of them help facilitate fire. So chamise helps fire burn hotter and bigger and spread faster. Other things like coyote brush and toyon help dampen fire. And so as fire moves, for example, through a diverse chaparral habitat, some things will make it burn hotter, some things will slow it down, and that all helps make this mosaic of different burning patterns. And so that absolutely helps increase biodiversity, because each of these plants burning a different way makes, different little micro habitats in them for other, for animals, for example, to survive differently, or to hide, or find refuge, or then find resources after the burn. And so absolutely, the way that all of these habitats has evolved with fire means that fire is very much responsible for biodiversity. Fire also can be responsible for for decreasing biodiversity if we have excluded it for a long time from an environment. If we have logged a whole bunch, fire burns through much more uniformly, and that can decrease biodiversity. So fire can do both. And it's something that I mentioned but didn't go into a whole lot of detail about. But humans in the West, long before Europeans came, absolutely understood this incredible power of working with fire as a partner to maintain biodiversity, and also to maintain, strictly for human uses, plants in forms that were most useful to humans. So it worked both for biodiversity and for human needs, for people to treat fire not just as a tool, but really as a partner, because fire does things that are completely beyond what we even understand that it's doing, that are important for an ecosystem. And so when Europeans came and excluded fire everywhere, that both, of course, took away a critical part of the culture of indigenous people who had been using it as a partner for so long, and also has greatly altered the way that fires burn here. And so, yes, absolutely, fire is important, but now that we've changed everything, fire can work both ways as far as biodiversity is concerned.
All right, another one. All the things are coming through now. All the chats are coming through. So a couple more questions here. If you're just starting to learn field sketching, how soon after you leave the environment do you go back and finish it with detail? Do you take notes on a separate journal to remind yourself?
No, everything. Well, so first question about how soon. Hmm, that also can vary really widely. Personally, it is certainly much more helpful if you can go and finish your drawings and add any extra notes as soon as possible. But I find as long as I have made some marks and notes and done some of that visual thinking, the thinking of taking what I'm seeing and translating it onto paper while I'm there, that embeds it in my memory in a way that just walking around and thinking doesn't. Especially if it's drawings. I mean, writing notes is one thing, but really, if I've been paying attention in a way to make any sort of a drawing, that's what's most critical for remembering it, and that helps enormously if I, manage to let a week go by, couple weeks go by before I go back and finish what I was working on. So I really think that the most important thing, rather than recording it any other way, is if you're really having your brain do that conversion between what you see in front of you and how you translate that on the page. And I don't, to the specific question about a separate journal, I don't make notes anywhere else. The only notes I make are the ones in this journal. And I guess I'm showing a page right now with a decent amount of words on it, but a lot of times I'm not writing that much at the time. I'm really focusing on the visual recording. And that's just a personal thing, very much a personal thing.
And another comment rolling into a question. This person is glad that you mentioned the writing because along with presenting excellent observations and research, it is so warm and personal and such a pleasure to read. Do you have any favorite authors that inspired you?
That was an excellent question. And I am, of course, my mind is now going to go completely blank on answers. Give me a second to turn my head and look at my bookshelf. There are so many authors that I love, and I'm gonna do a horrible disservice to them right now by forgetting all of them at one point. Okay, Terry Tempest Williams, Robin Wall Kimmerer. Let's see, who else? Barry Lopez. Helen McDonald. There's so many. I'm sorry. This is a sad answer, but yeah.
Probably to your bookshelf.
I know.
Take your camera over to your bookshelf and show us there.
Yes. Well, and I think the important thing is I read a whole lot of natural history type authors, and so that was a critical part of me being able to turn this into something literary when I hadn't necessarily been thinking of that in the beginning.
Yes, I will echo it that I was surprised to hear that you weren't originally intending it to have as much narrative in there, because you do a great job. So it's well done.
Yeah, since my background is history, no, my background is science. And my writing has always been much more of a scientific, technical nature in the past. And when I had originally envisioned a book, I had envisioned something much more academic, not strictly academic, but much more straightforward and sort of laying out, okay, this is what happens in a chaparral habitat, etc. And so I'm extremely grateful for the push to go in the more literary direction, because I think I was able to communicate so much more and so many more important things that way than I would have been any other way.
Yes. All right. Well, Robin, thank you. Appreciate it. This was a great way to start off our 2023 Nature and You lecture series. So thank you for coming today or tonight. And thank you all for coming. If there are any other last minute questions, get them in now. 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm gonna give another reminder to go to tuleyome.org and check out our upcoming events. Get out into the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument region, or go to Stebbins Cold Canyon. You can pick up your copy of the Cold Canyon Fire Journals. Maybe you'll run into Robin out there doing some sketching. You can get her to sign your book if you have it on you. So, all right. Good night,
Thanks so
everybody.
much.
Thank you for joining us.